This is Duke University.
We have one case that has gone to the Supreme Court of Canada specifically on the niqab. That was a very particular context, and in fact the judgment focuses on that context, and that's the context of a criminal trial. So the woman was a victim, a victim of sexual assault, and wanted to testify wearing her niqab. The question for the Supreme Court was whether there should be some kind of general rule or prioritizing of interests and rights in this kind of context, that is thinking about the rights of the accused, of course, to be able to kind of confront the victim as witness on one hand, and then the right of the niqab wearing woman on the other. It's actually an interesting case because the answer is fuzzy, and it's a little bit an it all depends kind of answer. So for one judge at the Supreme Court, it was clear that it can never be the case that we should make a woman take off the niqab to, particularly in a sexual assault trial, that this would be in fact kind of re-victimizing her. Another judge said no, the criminal trial, there are no exceptions. One must be able to see the victim clearly. Neither of those positions won, actually. The majority said it's really going to be up to the trial judge in any given case to kind of hear the reasons for wearing the niqab, figure out in the particular context whether we can find a kind of mode of coming to agreement in a situation. I actually think that that's not a bad answer, really. It kind of
Case-by-case basis.
That's right. It's a case-by-case basis, and particularly in the context of the criminal law, perhaps makes sense. Although many would argue, and here and I understand this and sensitive to this, that in the sexual assault context, however, it is unfortunate to, in any situation, to make a victim kind of feel that there's an extra hurdle to coming forward with testimony. In general, though, the reason so that's the one case, if you like, a litigated case on the niqab itself that's gone to the Supreme Court. More interesting has been conversation across the country, but particularly in the last couple of decades in Quebec, at a kind of political level, at a level of kind of conflicts between hijab-wearing girls and dress codes in high schools, for example. This goes right back to the beginning of the 1990s. Not cases that went to court, thank goodness, actually, but cases where the question of kind of adhering to, for example, a dress code that says no head coverings at all. What do we do when we have a Muslim girl who says, but I want to wear a hijab?
What do you do?
Well, I would say when this first came up, lots of discussion, seen as a real problem. I think very interestingly, as of the early 2000s, and I'll talk about why, the issue of the hijab, like just a Muslim girl or woman wearing a hijab, has largely disappeared. It's not that Muslim women and girls who wear hijabs have disappeared. They have not at all. But making an issue of it anywhere in the country has kind of disappeared, including Quebec, partly because, and this is very interesting, in 2010, I think the government of Quebec at the time introduced legislation focused on the niqab itself. It actually specifically talked about a face covering. So it was clear that just a head covering, no longer a problem, but that a woman should remove a face covering in an encounter with respect to delivery of a public service. So on either side, whether as the client or the provider of the service. That legislation actually died on the order table, never actually was passed, reintroduced in the proposed so-called Charter of Values by a later Quebec government last year. That also died, hasn't happened. So the question of, I don't think so much head coverings, but kind of full body or face coverings continues to be a hot issue in conversations in particular, kind of political level conversations, with a sense that in an educational context or context in which you can make a good argument on the basis of either security concerns or on the basis of kind of communication in an educational context, that it might well be appropriate to have a rule or at least a request that a niqab or burqa be removed. And so kind of a distinction's been drawn, if you like, between the niqab on one hand and the hijab on the other. Well, so as Charles Taylor has talked about, we have a kind of laïcité ouverte, or an open secularism, and of course, that question, right, is complex. There are so many different forms of so-called laïcité. Obviously, Quebec influenced in many ways by France through a shared language and literature and kind of watching what's going on in France, but not the same strong version, if you like, of laïcité at all. In fact, the French will often look to Quebec and say, is that right? You had Catholic school boards and Protestant school boards in the public school system until the 1990s? And yes, indeed, that's right. So this is far from a kind of strictly secular country in general, particularly with the historical constitutional promise to Catholic minorities outside Quebec and Protestant minorities within Quebec. That's always been there. So I think most people would kind of say that we have a certain kind of commitment to laïcité in the sense of the state not adopting or enforcing anymore any particular religious authority, obviously, or preferring any particular religious tradition. But people would usually say a laïcité ouverte, or open laïcité, in the sense of protecting individual freedoms. And right now there are issues about kind of institutional kind of autonomy as well.